In a world shattered by disaster gates, betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. Once a hero, a sword god, Suho fought to protect humanity. But now, he faces the impossible, betrayal from those he trusted most. Even in his final moments, he refuses to give in. But endings aren't always the end. Suho wakes up in the past, during humanity's darkest time. Given one last chance to change his destiny, Suho must rise again, stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. The gates still stand. His legend begins again. One man, one mission, a world to save. Now the story begins. In a mountain landscape, under bright daylight, a group of people stood together, staring at a lone figure lying before them. And Suho, a swordsman, was on the ground, holding his broken sword. He was visibly tired, his body bruised and poisoned, his breathing heavy. He looked up at the people he had once trusted most, frustration clear in his eyes. One of them muttered, mocking Suho's attempt to stay strong despite his broken sword. Nearby, Alex Morgan, a warrior, looked at him with a sense of regret. He thought it would have been easier if Suho had just joined them from the start. But he knew how stubborn people in Suho's position could be. Next to him, a girl, Suzuki Endo, a mage holding a staff glowing with dark energy, spoke with contempt. She criticized the difference in talent and ability between her and someone like Suho, who she sarcastically called a sword god. She also mentioned she didn't like men in suits, clearly showing her dislike for people like him. Suho looked at them, the pain in his eyes showing. His thoughts drifted back to the times they fought together, celebrating victories, feeling triumphant and smiling. And now, they stood against him, as if everything they had done together meant nothing. "We've been fighting together all this time," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. He demanded to know how they could betray him, how they could turn their backs on everything they had achieved. His voice became louder, more desperate as he pleaded for answers. Isabella, the healer of the group, spoke with a flat expression. She said it was unfortunate, but unavoidable. Suho was the only one opposing the current plan, the one who refused to follow along. Suho asked if they weren't ashamed of betraying everything they had fought for. He reminded them that they had already conquered one of the 5 disaster gates. If they took down the remaining 4, humanity would be safe, free from the constant threat of monsters. But now, they wanted to abandon that gate and leave humanity in danger. Suho couldn't understand how they could choose such a path. He accused them, saying they were no different from the monsters they had fought. Hexhood, the group's archer, responded calmly. He pointed out that at least they hadn't killed any humans. He explained that if all the gates were conquered, hunters like them would lose their purpose. Once seen as heroes, they would be nothing more than thugs in the eyes of the people. Hex then spoke directly to Suho, suggesting that Suho wouldn't want to become someone people feared. He tried to persuade him one last time, offering his hand and telling him to join them. Suho's face twisted with anger. He felt betrayed, and Hex's words only deepened his pain. After everything they had done together, Hex expected him to just join them as if nothing had happened. Suho rejected the offer, glaring at the group defiantly. Inside, he knew he didn't have much time. His body was poisoned by Suzuki's venom, and his wounds were too severe to heal. He understood he wouldn't survive this fight. There was only one thing left he could do. If he couldn't live, he would at least take one of them down to help ensure humanity's future. With this thought, he gripped his broken sword, a fire of determination lighting his weary eyes. His last duty as a hero, he decided, would be to sacrifice himself, even if it meant taking just one enemy with him. The group tensed as they sensed his resolve. Energy began swirling around him, his power building as he stepped forward with purpose. Alex, standing with the group, was visibly confused, while Suzuki tried to calm everyone down. She dismissed Suho, saying he was just bluffing. After all, he was just a swordsman with a broken weapon. But Hex wasn't so sure. Something felt different. There was something about Suho's energy that made him uneasy. The tension in the air became thick, and suddenly, with a burst of power, Suho moved. His sword cut through the air with deadly speed. The attack was swift and brutal, catching the group off guard. Suzuki was struck down instantly, her body falling lifelessly to the ground, while Alex screamed in agony as his arms were severed from his body. Hex acted quickly, narrowly avoiding Suho's strike and pulling Isabella to safety. He marveled at the speed of the attack, realizing that if he had been even a moment slower, he would have met the same fate. He couldn't understand how Suho was able to strike with such power. His sword was broken, and his body was poisoned. It didn't make sense. Alex, holding his left arm, his face twisted in pain, struggled to cope with the agony of losing his limb. Isabella rushed to Alex's side, her hands glowing with healing magic. But something was wrong. She looked at his wound in shock. She couldn't heal it. Her eyes widened as the truth hit her. She had heard of it before, but she had never seen it. The wound caused by Suho was beyond healing. It wasn't something magic could fix. It was a power that surpassed the human realm. The injury was too great for any spell to mend. Suho, battered and drained of energy, looked at his sword. It began to glow, an intense aura surrounding it. Hex, watching from a distance, finally understood. It was an intangible sword, formed purely by willpower. A sword made of energy. Suho felt a grim satisfaction as he realized that he had finally achieved what he had been striving for, the ultimate swordsmanship, even in his final moments. With one last surge of power, he smiled for the final time. Then, he fell, his body disappearing over the edge of the cliff. As he fell, a system notification flashed in his mind, congratulating him for reaching the realm of divine sword unity. The system praised his achievements, listing new abilities and announcing that the player system was rebooting. The world around Suho turned dark as he felt his life slipping away. He had completed his final mission, sacrificing everything to defeat his enemies. But regret lingered in his heart. He felt the cold, inevitable pull of death. Suddenly, the darkness faded, replaced by a blinding light. The light took the form of a city, one far different from the battle-worn cliffs where he had just met his end. Suho opened his eyes, disoriented. It wasn't the afterlife he had expected. Instead, it was a bustling, chaotic urban city. A firefighter appeared in his vision, his voice tense but urgent. The man told Suho that he was injured and insisted on taking him to a safe zone. When the firefighter mentioned a gate outbreak, Suho's eyes widened in surprise. He thought for sure he had died back in that dungeon. As Suho was carried through the streets, he looked around, confused. Tall buildings towered over him, but the destruction was unmistakable. A massive explosion rumbled in the distance, sending debris flying across the street. He glanced at a station sign, and the name, Cinderim, flashed before him. The name struck him hard. Cinderim Station was once a location lost to a gate outbreak, contaminated during one of humanity's darkest times. Yet here he was, witnessing the same catastrophe all over again. As he struggled to understand his situation, a goblin appeared from the shadows of the gate. Suho murmured the words, Cinderim Station Gate Outbreak, under his breath, feeling the sheer impossibility of it all. Then, out of nowhere, an arrow sliced through the air, striking the firefighter carrying him. The man let out a strangled cry, collapsing to the ground. The chaos around them grew louder, goblins shrieking, their voices swallowed by the sounds of battle. The firefighter urged Suho to run, pointing to the safe zone he had mentioned. Suho's eyes narrowed, ready to face whatever came next. He spotted an axe nearby, leaning against a pile of debris. Without thinking twice, he grabbed it. He knew he had to act fast. There was no time to hesitate, not now. Despite the firefighter's frantic warnings, Suho swung the axe with effortless precision, honed from countless battles, and took down the goblin in one clean strike. Afterward, Suho glanced at his hands, expecting to see wounds or feel pain. But there was nothing. His hands were steady and unbroken. A sudden realization hit him. This was just like before, like when he had first awakened as a player. A system notification appeared in his mind, the words glowing brightly. It congratulated him for meeting the awakening conditions and urged him to become stronger. Suho let out a laugh, filled with disbelief and amusement. The situation felt strangely familiar. Around him, the city was in ruins, with chaos unfolding everywhere. Another notification popped up, this time offering him a choice. A digital screen appeared in front of him, with 4 glowing options: warrior, mage, archer, and healer. He stared at the choices, memories flooding back. He had faced this same decision before, long ago. Back then, he had chosen the path of a warrior without hesitation. Now, he found himself standing at the same crossroad again. Suho thought back to everything that had led him to this point. His instincts urged him to pick warrior again, but something held him back. Finally, he spoke aloud, asking the system to delay his selection. There was a different path to take this time, and Suho wasn't sure which direction his future would lead him. As the chaos of the city raged on around him, the firefighter called out, desperate to pull him away from the danger. But Suho stayed rooted in place. He assured the firefighter there was no need to worry. He could handle the goblins on his own. They were just goblins after all. The firefighter hesitated but then stepped back. The goblins, with their glowing eyes and crude weapons, approached menacingly. Suho stood tall, ready for them. He unleashed his power, charging at the goblins with the same unyielding determination he had always shown. His movements were quick, his focus sharp as he ran down a burning street, dodging attacks from the goblins with precision. Every step carried the weight of his past experiences, his body reacting instinctively as he avoided their blows. He spotted a red axe amidst the debris, grabbed it, and swung it fiercely at the nearest goblin. The creature fell, and Suho's resolve only grew stronger. He was ready for more. With a determined leap, he attacked another goblin, cutting through it with powerful, precise strikes. It was as if Suho had become a force of nature, his movements fluid and unstoppable. It truly was Goblin Slayer time. Standing over the fallen creatures, Suho remained calm and composed. He muttered to himself that goblins were only a threat to beginners. They were nothing to someone like him. He spotted a goblin sword nearby, testing its weight in his hands before declaring his intent to cut down every one of them. The battle that followed was fierce as Suho moved swiftly, his strikes powerful and precise. With each swing of the sword, goblins fell one after another, their attempts to resist futile. Soon, the battlefield was silent, the only sound his heavy breathing. As he stood among the fallen, Suho realized his anger hadn't fully subsided. He had gotten carried away in the heat of battle. He reminded himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. Looking around, a thought struck him. This wasn't just another fight. He had somehow returned to the past. This was an opportunity, a fresh start. Suddenly, several holographic panels appeared in front of him, displaying his achievements and skills. He saw basic swordsmanship skills listed, ones he hadn't thought about in a long time. Suho allowed himself a small smile, reminiscing about the early days of his journey. It was like starting over completely. The goblin sword in his hand was shorter than he would have liked, but it would work for now. At that moment, the firefighter cautiously approached him, still visibly shaken by the recent events. The firefighter stammered, asking if Suho was a player. Suho nodded, answering calmly, yes. After everything that had just happened, he already knew the answer to that question. He made his selection on the holographic screen, the system offering him a choice of powers. This time, he chose the healer class. A confirmation screen appeared, congratulating him on his decision. Suho was granted bonus stats and a new skill, Healing Light F. He turned his attention back to the firefighter, noticing the man's injuries. He approached the firefighter, inspecting his wounds, and gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The firefighter was confused but didn't pull away. A soft blue aura enveloped them both, signaling the activation of Suho's healing ability. Slowly, the firefighter's wounds began to heal. His eyes widened in shock as the pain faded. The firefighter struggled to find words, his voice full of disbelief. He asked if Suho was really a healer, and Suho, with a faint smile, replied, "I guess that's who I am now." Another system notification appeared, offering Suho a reward for using his healing skill. He was presented with an option to choose a weapon from the system's arsenal. Suho took a moment to think. Even though he had chosen the healer class, he still needed a weapon for combat. He summoned a glowing sword from the system's arsenal. It was a basic beginner's sword, but it would do for now. Suho examined it thoughtfully. There was still much to accomplish, and his journey was only beginning. He looked at the distant gate looming ahead, his resolve hardening. He announced his intent to go and conquer it. The firefighter, alarmed, tried to stop Suho, warning him of the dangers ahead. But Suho remained unshaken. He assured the firefighter that there was something to gain from this, a purpose he needed to fulfill. As Suho confidently walked toward the gate, memories flooded his mind. He remembered his past triumphs, the skills he had honed through years of hard work and perseverance. Just like before, the abilities gained through talent were still with him, no matter the class he chose. But he also recalled the skills tied specifically to each class, like healing magic, which only a healer could wield. He remembered Isabella's Holy Spirit Light, which had started as the basic healing light. If only he had been able to heal himself back then, things might have ended differently. This time, Suho knew it had to be different. He would be both a swordsman and a healer, perhaps even a paladin. That was the path he would walk now. He would prevent the mistakes of his past and become stronger than those who had betrayed him. As he stood before the gate, his mind lingered on the faces of his former allies. Their indifferent expressions haunted him, reminding him of how things had turned out. He had to acquire skills faster, level up quicker, if he was to surpass his past self. This gate, a premonition gate, had nearly cost him his life before. But now he was ready. His skill level might be low for now, and the challenges ahead might seem overwhelming. But that was fine. The swordsmanship engraved in his memory remained strong. Suho was determined to start over and overcome his limitations. With fire in his eyes, he stepped toward the glowing, colorful portal. The past had given him a second chance, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. It was time to rewrite his story. Suho walked cautiously through the dense, wet forest, his steps muffled by the soft ground beneath him. He moved slowly, eyes scanning his surroundings with careful precision, alert for any danger lurking in the shadows. The thick foliage brushed against his body as he advanced, and then he noticed something, a creature lying motionless on the ground. It was a goblin, its body lifeless, a sign of the chaos that had unfolded here. He muttered to himself that the goblins, which had once been rampaging outside the gate as if they owned the world, were now all dead inside. It seemed the goblins had fled through the gate, escaping from something far more terrifying. Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness, and Suho froze. His eyes sharpened, focusing on the source of the sound, ready for whatever danger might come next. Suho's instincts proved right. The reason behind the goblins' frantic retreat soon became clear. Two hobgoblins emerged from the shadows, their eyes burning with hostility. One was level 10, the other level 12. Their bright red skin and muscular frames made them stand out as far more dangerous than regular goblins. They glared at Suho, ready to claim him as their next prey, replacing the goblins they had just hunted. Suho smiled, unfazed by their aggressive presence. To him, they were still just goblins, no matter their size or the aura of menace they carried. With confidence, he stepped forward, preparing for the battle. The clash began as Suho met the hobgoblin's powerful strikes with his own. He dodged nimbly, but quickly realized that his sword barely made an impact. Their tough, reinforced skin was too strong for his current level to pierce. Suho knew that relying solely on strength wouldn't work. He had to find a way around their defense. If his physical attacks couldn't break through, he'd have to use his wits. The fight grew fiercer with each passing moment, but Suho focused on finding an opening. He needed to be clever, not just strong. And then he saw his chance. With a powerful leap, he soared into the air, his sword raised high. He aimed for one hobgoblin's vulnerable eye and struck with precision. The creature recoiled in pain and collapsed, falling before Suho could even react. Suho blinked, surprised. He hadn't intended to take it down so quickly, but his instincts had led him to victory. He sighed, reminding himself to be more careful with his force next time. But there was no time to second-guess. The battle wasn't over yet. A massive hobgoblin appeared from the distance, charging toward him. Its massive muscles bulged, and it moved with terrifying speed. Suho's gaze sharpened. This was his chance to push forward. Suho decided to make use of the hobgoblin's aggression. The creature lunged at him with a roar, but Suho dodged effortlessly. As he avoided each strike, he quickly realized he was growing more agile with every movement. His evasion was becoming more fluid, more natural. After several successful dodges, Suho felt a sense of improvement in himself. With each close call, his body moved quicker, more instinctively. The fight was becoming easier, and he knew that these small victories were shaping him into something stronger. Then, as the hobgoblin swung at him again, Suho blocked its blow with a sharp, precise parry. The strike was heavy, but he felt the movement come naturally, and the impact was absorbed perfectly. The hobgoblin paused, momentarily thrown off balance by the effective counter. Suho took a moment to reflect. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was mastering his abilities. With a few more successful parries, Suho felt an undeniable shift in his confidence. He had turned the battle around. Despite being outmatched in strength, he was outmaneuvering his opponent with skill and precision. The hobgoblin seemed to be tiring, its attacks growing slower and more predictable. Suho knew that with this new edge, he had the upper hand. Suho studied his fallen opponent, noting the hobgoblin's unsteady stance. Frustration was evident in its movements, and Suho knew the moment had come to end the battle. With unwavering confidence, he faced the creature, his resolve clear. He had gained the experience he needed, and now, it was time to finish what he had started. With a swift movement, his sword sliced through the air. The hobgoblin let out a strangled cry before collapsing, defeated at Suho's feet. Sunlight streamed through the dense forest, casting a warm glow over the fallen creature. Suho stood over the body, his gaze cold and focused. But there was no time for rest. He knew there were more enemies to face, more challenges ahead. He spoke aloud, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm ready to earn some real experience now." Meanwhile, outside the gate, a group of hunters gathered, their voices filled with annoyance. One of them muttered about someone barging into the gate without permission, their frustration mounting. They speculated about which faction the lone player might belong to, and one joked that if the player ended up dying inside, it would become a legendary tale. Elsewhere, two men in suits stood on a cracked city street, speaking with the firefighter who had encountered Suho. The men seemed confused and irritated, demanding more details about the person who had entered the gate. The firefighter described Suho, how he was a beginner player who had taken on a group of goblins alone and even healed the firefighter's wounds before entering the gate. He repeated Suho's words, that the young man had something to gain from this. The two suited men surveyed the scene around them. Goblin corpses littered the street, the aftermath of a battle they hadn't even been a part of. One of them stood still, staring in disbelief. They hadn't arrived late, yet the goblins had already been dealt with, and the person responsible was, of all things, a healer. The thought seemed almost absurd to them, but the evidence was undeniable. The goblin bodies lay scattered around, proof that a healer had gone into the gate alone and wiped them out. It didn't make sense. One of the men pondered aloud, gazing at the city as his expression grew serious. If all that was inside the gate were just goblins, then the challenge can't be that great. But still, it's strange. He's a healer, yet not a scratch on him. He wiped out all those goblins without breaking a sweat. What exactly is going on? Unease settled over him as he continued to inspect the destruction around him. Something about the situation didn't add up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the healer than met the eye. The suited man stood amidst the destruction, his mind racing. It felt reckless, almost as if the healer had charged in without a clear plan. But the results spoke volumes. He couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The goblins were dead, and a healer had done it. What if, just what if, this healer succeeded in clearing the gate? What would that mean? Urgency flashed across his features as he turned to a subordinate nearby. His voice was sharp with authority as he issued his orders. Any change in the gate, report it immediately. If anyone emerges, you let me know. No delays. The subordinate nodded, taking off at once, while the suited man pulled out his phone. His mind was made up. If that healer really managed to clear the gate, they couldn't afford to let him slip away. Someone with that kind of potential needed to be brought into the fold, for both their sake and his. As the suited men went about their plans, the scene shifted back to Suho. He was deep in the heart of the forest, the air thick with magic and danger. His sword danced through the air, slashing down hobgoblins with precision, each strike cutting through them like a knife through butter. His movements were fluid, effortless, as bodies fell around him in quick succession. As he moved, he spotted one hobgoblin, its stance shaky, fear apparent in its eyes. Suho paused, a hint of amusement flickering in his gaze. He didn't need to kill this one. Instead, he decided to give it a chance to run. "Go ahead," he muttered, his voice cold but oddly casual. "Bring more of your friends." The hobgoblin screeched, its terror overwhelming any remnants of pride. It turned and fled into the depths of the forest, leaving Suho standing, watching it disappear into the shadows. Without missing a beat, Suho turned his attention inward. He opened his status window, inspecting his attributes with a critical eye. His goal was simple: balance. He'd learned that from experience. Raising all his stats evenly seemed to be the most logical approach, ensuring that no weakness could be exploited. He applied the bonus points, watching his stats rise as the numbers shifted. He noticed how quickly he was leveling up. The monsters here were nothing like the challenges he'd faced before, but the speed at which he was gaining experience was a small reminder of how far he'd come. The list of skills that had appeared was a testament to his growing power: throw, sidestep, and others, each a building block of the warrior he had once been, now reinforced by the healing abilities he had embraced. His gaze shifted downward, focusing on the bodies of the fallen hobgoblins. He searched with purpose, eyes narrowing as he scanned for something valuable. And there it was, a faintly glowing red crystal. A degrade stone. He knelt, picking it up, his expression softening into a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't the most glamorous item, but it had its uses, especially now. He estimated it could fetch about 50,000 won, which would be more than enough for a start. As he pocketed the stone, his attention drifted back to the area around him. He wasn't alone for long. A slight rustle in the trees caught his ear, and his body tensed instinctively. He raised his weapon, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. More enemies were closing in, and his instincts told him this would be no ordinary fight. The hobgoblins were back, this time in greater numbers. As the shadows coalesced into shapes, Suho counted them. 30 or so hobgoblins, their eyes gleaming red, each one more dangerous than the last. His lips curved into a wry smile. The real fight was about to begin. "Perfect," Suho muttered to himself, readying his sword. "Time to level up before the boss shows up." The hobgoblins advanced, their growls filling the air as they circled him. It was exactly the kind of challenge he had been hoping for: more experience, more skills to master, and perhaps, just maybe, a chance to test his new healing abilities in battle. He gripped his sword tighter, prepared to take on the swarm that was fast closing in. This time he would be ready. The hobgoblins charged at Suho, but he stood his ground and faced them directly. With skill and speed, he avoided their attacks while striking back with deadly precision. His hits were strong, and his sword easily cut through his enemies. The hobgoblins didn't stop attacking, but Suho stayed calm. He moved like a force of nature, focused on ending the fight quickly. One by one, the hobgoblins fell, each letting out a painful scream before collapsing. During the battle, a new, powerful attack came at him. A bigger hobgoblin joined the fight, swinging a massive axe toward him. Suho smiled and easily blocked the strike. This was the one he had been waiting for. The giant hobgoblin, with a twisted face and dark presence, stepped forward. The forest around them turned a red, eerie color. Suho's eyes locked on the creature as a system notification appeared in front of him. Chief Hobgoblin Level 20. He stood tall, drawing his sword with confidence. The time had come to face the boss monster. Suho stayed calm, a small smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. He was ready. This battle was just the start of his plan to change his fate. His focus was clear: to grow stronger and rewrite his story. Suho looked at the chief hobgoblin, feeling the tension in the air, as if the whole place was waiting for the fight to begin. Without hesitation, he moved to face the hobgoblin chief, and the clash started immediately. Suho moved fast, matching every attack with perfect timing. The chief hobgoblin was fierce, swinging its weapons with brutal strength, but Suho remained calm, listening to its desperate roars. When a regular hobgoblin tried to sneak up behind him, Suho effortlessly dodged and countered with quick, accurate strikes. The forest echoed with the sound of clashing swords and the cries of the fallen demons. Suho thought that these hobgoblins were nothing but weaklings. He didn't want them to interrupt his real fight. As he defeated each one, he found it almost amusing. These creatures were no challenge for him. But then the atmosphere changed when the chief hobgoblin used a special skill. Suddenly, Suho felt his whole body freeze as the system announced that the chief hobgoblin had used a fear skill. The heavy feeling wrapped around him like chains, locking his muscles. Suho realized the danger. The higher the enemy's level, the stronger the fear effect became. It was a skill designed to paralyze him, to stop him completely. Suho gritted his teeth, realizing he had nothing in his inventory to counteract such mental attacks. No skills. No items. But Suho refused to be weak. Even without any special abilities, he knew how to overcome it. His eyes grew steely as he made a choice, gripping his sword so tightly that his hands began to bleed. The pain shocked him back into reality, and his body responded as he forced himself to move. The system announced that he had broken free from the fear, and Suho felt his determination return. He quickly dodged a narrow attack from the chief hobgoblin and struck back with a fast counter. The creature seemed stunned by his strength, but Suho didn't hesitate. He swiftly finished off the remaining smaller hobgoblins, one by one. The system confirmed that all the hobgoblins had been defeated. Standing in the aftermath, Suho used his healing energy. The forest briefly glowed with a warm light as the healing energy surrounded him, restoring his body. But Suho knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The chief hobgoblin reappeared, its dangerous aura unmistakable, its weapon reflecting the dim light. Suho stared at it, showing no fear in his calm expression. He was ready for a one-on-one fight, just the two of them. The battle was fierce, with both combatants giving it everything they had. Suho noticed the level difference was an issue. His attacks weren't causing much damage. Suho stayed focused on the chief, knowing that each hit mattered and that the small injuries he inflicted would slowly wear down the creature. His sword gleamed slightly as he gathered his energy, preparing for a decisive strike. He aimed for the weak points, taking advantage of the wounds he'd already caused. With a powerful lunge, he drove his sword deep into the hobgoblin. The creature cried out in pain, but it still tried to use its fear skill. Suho was beyond that now. He had already beaten fear once, and it couldn't control him again. He kept attacking, delivering blow after blow with unwavering determination. His expression was one of fierce resolve. With one final, powerful strike, Suho finished the battle. The chief hobgoblin's face showed shock as it collapsed. But Suho wasn't finished yet. He used his healing energy to bring the monster back to life, forcing it to fight him once more. He repeated this process, fighting the creature over and over until he felt satisfied, until his skills had been perfected. The system notified him of his progress. Many of his skills had leveled up, and his strength had increased. Suho looked at his hands, feeling the new power coursing through him. The time had come for the hobgoblin's role to end. With a grim smile, Suho struck the final blow, decapitating the creature. The system confirmed his victory. The chief hobgoblin was dead, the gate had been conquered, and Suho was named the MVP. He felt a surge of energy as he leveled up, all his stats improved, and he received bonus points. Multiple screens appeared before him, announcing new skills and abilities. His healing light had been upgraded, and a new skill, Cure, had been added. Suho allowed himself a small smile. Now, he no longer needed to fear status ailments. Eventually, he'd become strong enough to cure even the deadliest poisons. He looked at the glowing mana stone from the fallen boss, feeling satisfied. He had taken everything he needed from this place. It was time to move on. His thoughts wandered to the familiar faces he hadn't seen in a long while. A feeling of anticipation stirred inside him. Outside the gate, the world was in chaos. People gathered below, their faces a mix of fear and awe as the gate trembled. Whispers of uncertainty spread through the crowd as a bright light appeared, and a figure began to step out. All eyes were on the gate, wondering who or what was emerging. Suho walked out of the gate with confidence, his presence exuding a strong and mysterious energy. The people around him murmured in amazement. They wondered if he had really conquered the gate alone. The crowd was filled with disbelief, and the question of whether he had truly been by himself echoed throughout. Many scouts hurriedly approached Suho, trying to get his attention. They introduced themselves as members of the Immortal Guild, another from the Warang Guild, all eager to recruit him. But Suho ignored them, jumping down and landing smoothly before the crowd. He moved forward with purpose, heading toward a man in a suit, extending his hand confidently. The man looked confused by the sudden interaction. Suho greeted him, and it turned out that the man was ᴄᴏᴘᴘыឫ, the team leader of the South Korean Hunter Association. Another man in a suit, standing beside Cheolman, asked if he knew Suho, but Cheolman admitted that he had no idea who this person was. He was genuinely confused. Later, as the sun began to set, the scene shifted to a large building marked as the South Korean Hunter Association. Inside an office, young Cheolman sat at his desk, facing Suho. Cheolman appeared lost in thought, trying to remember their first meeting. He recalled when Suho had greeted him confidently and shook his hand. Suho introduced himself and mentioned that he had business with the association, specifically that he was planning to get a hunter's license. Cheolman was taken aback. Issuing a hunter's license was a serious process, and from what he could gather, this wasn't just a renewal. It seemed that Suho was an unregistered hunter. Cheolman's mind raced as he thought about what that meant. Suho was a newly awakened player, and considering his abilities, it was surprising. The healer class was often seen as the weakest among the 4 main class categories, yet Suho had managed to conquer a gate on his own. As Cheolman examined Suho's hunter aptitude test results, they appeared more like those of a warrior than a healer. This caught his interest. Suho, calm and casual, ate something while waiting for Cheolman's response. Noticing Cheolman's hesitation as he looked over the results, Suho asked if there was a problem. Cheolman reassured him, saying there was nothing to worry about. He confirmed Suho's name, on Suho, and began asking about his background. Cheolman was curious about what Suho had done before becoming a hunter. Suho explained that he was a college dropout. When Cheolman probed further, Suho admitted he hadn't done well in college. He smiled lightly, making the statement seem less serious. Cheolman wondered if he had been a medical student, but Suho revealed that he had studied physical education instead. This only confused Cheolman further. Usually, healers came from medical backgrounds, so it was unusual for someone with a physical education background to choose the healer path. Cheolman then asked why Suho had chosen healing over becoming a warrior or an archer. Suho smiled again and said it was because he hated getting hurt. His answer was simple but unexpected, and Cheolman couldn't help but find it amusing. His curiosity grew, and he couldn't hold back any longer. He asked Suho how he had managed to conquer the gate alone. Suho thought back to the events, remembering his battle with the hobgoblin. He explained that there hadn't been much of a plan or strategy. When he entered the gate, a hobgoblin attacked him, and he fought back just to survive. Cheolman was startled when he heard the mention of the hobgoblin. Suho confirmed it was a hobgoblin and then opened his inventory. In an instant, glowing magic crystals appeared on the table. Suho explained that he had obtained them by killing not just a hobgoblin, but also its chief. He admitted that he didn't really know the value of these magic crystals and asked Cheolman to handle them. Cheolman, still processing everything he had just heard, agreed to take care of it. He picked up one of the crystals and began preparing it for processing, his shock still lingering, but he focused on the task at hand. Cheolman then turned to Suho and asked if he was truly committed to becoming a hunter. Suho confidently confirmed that he was. He had made that decision the moment he awakened as a player. Cheolman couldn't help but comment on how significant that decision was. But in his mind, he felt it was somewhat impulsive. He asked Suho if there was a specific reason behind his choice. Suho smiled and noticed that Cheolman wasn't very good at hiding his thoughts. The conversation grew more serious as Suho explained his reasons for wanting to become a hunter. He told Cheolman that he had lost his entire family due to gate shock. Suho hated monsters and gates deeply. He believed becoming a hunter was his way of fighting back. He admitted that entering the gate alone had been an emotional choice, driven by his desire to relieve his own frustration. However, killing the monsters hadn't given him the peace he sought. The pain in his heart was still there. Suho realized that his true purpose was more than just killing monsters. He wanted to make sure no one else would have to suffer the way he had. He wanted to protect people from losing their loved ones to monsters. With a serious expression, he stated that he wanted to work for everyone's safety. ᴄᴏᴘ looked at Suho with a sense of awe. Suho's determination was clear. He wasn't just becoming a hunter for personal gain, but for the greater good. His expression was firm, signaling that this decision was final. ᴄᴏᴘ explained that becoming a part of the Hunter Association meant living as a civil servant hunter. He pointed out, with a slight hesitation, that their pay was much lower compared to what hunters made in private guilds. It wasn't just a small difference. The pay was significantly lower. Suho listened attentively, his expression calm but resolute. When it was his turn to speak, Suho made it clear that he already knew about the lower pay. But for him, what mattered more than money was something else. He valued the free access to various gates, the priority to conquer them, and the authority that came with being part of the South Korean Hunter Association. He also wanted the power to impose strict punishments for player crimes, something only the association could truly offer. ᴄᴏᴘ blinked in surprise at Suho's words, genuinely curious. He asked what exactly Suho meant by wanting those privileges. ᴄᴏᴘ thought to himself that most people would probably prefer to work in an office rather than go out and conquer gates. He leaned back, surprised by what he was hearing, and wondered aloud if such things were even possible. ᴄᴏᴘ clarified that while the Hunter Association did have the rights to conquer various gates, those rights were often auctioned off to private guilds. The reasoning was simple. There was no logic in risking one's life to attack dangerous gates for a low government salary. He continued, saying that people often viewed becoming a hunter civil servant as a form of altruism. However, most people pursued the civil servant hunter role for the stability it offered, choosing administrative work over actually entering gates. ᴄᴏᴘ explained that most civil servants would do anything to avoid the gates, but Suho was different. Suho wasn't just interested in stability or pay. He spoke passionately about public safety and was clearly someone willing to work directly in the field. ᴄᴏᴘ found himself in awe. He saw Suho as the perfect civil servant hunter, someone who truly cared about protecting people, a real embodiment of patriotism. He was exactly what the association needed. ᴄᴏᴘ couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Half-jokingly, he admitted that he was so happy it almost made him dizzy. Suho, noticing ᴄᴏᴘ's reaction, leaned forward with concern and asked if he was all right. ᴄᴏᴘ quickly composed himself, cleared his throat, and adjusted his posture. He confessed that it had been a long time since he'd met someone like Suho. He assured him he would handle the paperwork and identification needed. ᴄᴏᴘ then explained that to officially join, Suho would need to complete the hunter exam, which included an aptitude test, a written exam, and a practical exam. However, there was a catch. ᴄᴏᴘ's expression shifted slightly as he explained that registration for the current year's exam had already closed, and the exam day was actually tomorrow. Suho's eyes widened in shock. But before Suho could fully worry, ᴄᴏᴘ remained calm and smiled confidently. He reassured Suho that if he was interested, he could still register him as an exception. Suho's face lit up with excitement, and he quickly asked if that was really possible. ᴄᴏᴘ nodded, explaining that it was allowed within the existing rules. Since Suho had conquered a gate alone, they could report it to the higher-ups and get approval for his late registration. ᴄᴏᴘ then became more serious. He admitted that he recommended Suho because of his clear talent, but he also pointed out the challenge ahead. He explained that preparing for both the written and practical exams in just one day would be tough. While ᴄᴏᴘ wasn't concerned about Suho's physical performance, given his impressive skills, he did have doubts about the written part. Suho clenched his fist, showing his determination. ᴄᴏᴘ, still concerned, repeated his worry about the written exam, but Suho leaned forward, his voice strong and confident. He asked ᴄᴏᴘ to go ahead and register him, assuring him that he was ready for the challenge. ᴄᴏᴘ blinked in surprise but nodded, impressed by Suho's resolve. Suho continued, saying that it was a good idea to take the exam at least once for the experience, especially with the chance he had now. He added that it was just a test, and even if he failed, he could always take it again next time. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ couldn't help but admire Suho's bravery. With a slight smirk, he shook his head and remarked on what a brave man Suho was. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ then informed Suho that he could check his aptitude test result today. Suho thanked him for the information but hesitated for a moment before admitting that he didn't have the money for the registration fees. Suho asked if ᴄᴏᴘᴘ could handle the magic crystal transaction right away. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ nodded quickly, adjusting his tie, and promised to take care of it while also checking Suho's aptitude test. As ᴄᴏᴘᴘ left to complete the necessary steps, the atmosphere softened, and Suho found himself reflecting inwardly. His face grew thoughtful as he looked at ᴄᴏᴘ's retreating back. Suho realized that even now, ᴄᴏᴘ was the only person he could truly trust. A grateful smile spread across his face, and he silently thanked ᴄᴏᴘ. A while later, the two sat together, sharing a meal. ᴄᴏᴘ announced that all the aptitude tests were finished, and the money from the magic crystal had been deposited. Suho, still in awe, couldn't believe the amount when he saw it, around 3 million won. He took a sip from his drink and playfully remarked on it. ᴄᴏᴘ, a bit embarrassed, admitted that as a civil servant hunter, he received certain tax exemption benefits for magic crystals. Suho's eyes widened, impressed, and eagerly asked if it was really duty-free. Then, with a hopeful expression, he asked if he could ask one more favor. ᴄᴏᴘ, curious, asked what it was. Suho explained that he had heard the association had a library containing workbooks and reference materials for the upcoming test. Even though it was late and the test was tomorrow, Suho felt the need to cram as much as possible. He hesitated for a moment, then asked if it would be all right for him to study in the library. ᴄᴏᴘ's face lit up and he grinned enthusiastically, raising both of their drinks in excitement. He eagerly told Suho that, of course, he could use the library. Suho's face brightened in response, and he thanked ᴄᴏᴘ once again. The next scene unfolded in a brightly lit library, where ᴄᴏᴘ proudly gestured at the vast collection of books. He informed Suho that he didn't need an employee card when he left, so Suho was free to study there as long as he needed. With a cheerful wave, ᴄᴏᴘ wished him the best of luck on his test tomorrow and walked away, leaving Suho in quiet contemplation among the towering shelves. As ᴄᴏᴘ walked off, Suho watched him, his gaze softening with a mixture of admiration and guilt. He muttered to himself that brother ᴄᴏᴘ was still the same, kind and trustworthy, always there for him. Suho thought that ᴄᴏᴘ didn't know yet, but one day, he would become the president of the association. Suho sighed, admitting it had been hard pretending not to know anything. It felt like he'd been teasing ᴄᴏᴘ, but he also knew that acting like he already knew everything would only raise suspicions. He rose from his seat, his expression hardening with determination, as he walked deeper into the library. The sunset cast a warm, golden glow through the library windows, illuminating the rows of tall shelves. Suho whispered to himself that it was time to find what he was looking for. As Suho moved through the labyrinthine aisles of the library, scanning the spines of countless books, his mind wandered back to the major events that would unfold in the future. He knew the general outline, but he also knew he couldn't remember every single detail. After all, he was still human. He came to a particular shelf and stopped, pulling out a large, ancient-looking tome that had intricate patterns etched into its cover. He couldn't help but comment on how massive the book was. Suho opened it, revealing pages filled with cryptic symbols and foreign text. He recalled how he had once tried to extract information from this very book before. As his eyes skimmed the pages, something strange happened. The text began to glow softly, and a message appeared. The system informed him that the book was from another world. Suho focused on the words, noting that a single sentence had appeared, along with hints of different ways to interact with the book. With a mix of awe and concentration, Suho raised the book above his head, an aura of mystery surrounding him as the symbols shimmered. He then placed the book on his head, as it was said to be the way to use it. But after a few moments, frustration showed on his face. Why wasn't it working? He had been told this was the method, yet nothing seemed to happen. Just then, a notification popped up, and the system's voice announced that the Library of Memories was interested in his story. The book's pages began to turn on their own, glowing with a purple light that illuminated the entire room. The system's message continued, stating that the Library of Memories was inviting him. The book released an intense magical glow, and Suho stared in awe, sensing the magnitude of the moment. Finally, the system declared, "Welcome to the Library of Memories." The Library of Memories opened before Suho, and its grand book radiated a wave of shimmering magic that filled the entire space with blinding light. Suho stood still, fully aware of the significance of what was about to happen. This book was an artifact with the power to make a person remember everything they had seen and heard, including the painful memories that most people would choose to forget. Suho knew well that the human mind relied on the process of forgetting to survive. Endless vivid memories could easily become overwhelming. But Suho was willing to shoulder that burden. He knew that obtaining the Library of Memories came with a price, the curse of remembering everything. Yet, that curse was exactly what he needed. He was ready to take on even the most painful memories if it meant achieving his goals. He recalled the girl who was originally meant to acquire the skill, the one who was supposed to become the Hexagon Guild manager. She had once worked for the Korean Hunter Association before joining the Hexagon Guild. Suho remembered the story of how she had accidentally obtained the skill of the Library of Memories. Late one night, while studying in the library, she had used the book as a pillow, simply because sleeping face down was uncomfortable. It had been an innocent mistake, but it had forever changed her life. By sheer chance, she had gained the ability. Suho thought back to how he had learned about it from her, and a small smile tugged at his lips. He already planned to treat her to a meal the next time they met. She deserved at least that much. Without warning, a glowing system notification popped up before him, asking if he would be willing to donate his story to the Library of Memories. Suho paused for a moment, considering the immense power now within his reach. The library had the ability to store everything, even the small, overlooked moments of his past that would normally be lost to time. Suho clenched his fist, making up his mind to accept the offer. In an instant, a brilliant light surrounded him as the library began to record his story. Books floated around him, their covers glowing with strange symbols. The entire space hummed with an almost living energy, filled with the magic of countless untold tales. A message appeared in front of him, confirming the activation of the skill. The system explained that the Library of Memories would retain all the memories he had experienced, allowing him to revisit them at will. It would also suggest relevant information whenever necessary. Suho grimaced slightly, feeling an unfamiliar sensation flood his mind. The recording process was unlike anything he had ever felt before, disorienting, as if his very consciousness was being rearranged. He steadied himself, taking a deep breath. Wondering if the odd sensation was because the space around him was merely illusionary, he decided to test the skill. He focused on his past, and in an instant, the world around him dissolved into a swirling vortex of memories. The images of his last battle came rushing back to him, raw and intense. He could still feel the pain, the fury, the adrenaline coursing through him as though it was happening all over again. He thought about the final moments, the emotions still fresh in his mind. The memories accelerated. He saw the betrayal of those he had once called comrades, their faces twisted in hatred and greed. The memories were vivid, painful, and disturbingly real. Suho clenched his teeth, his eyes narrowing as the images of those traitors who had delayed the gate's destruction for their own gain flashed before him. Their cold, indifferent expressions burned in his mind. He swore to never forget them. His eyes hardened with the weight of the betrayal, and a faint scowl crossed his face. The experience was unpleasant, and Suho cursed himself for not thinking of a better memory to relive. As he sat in the uncomfortable aftermath, a new interface suddenly appeared before him. A cryptic message from the system caught his attention. He frowned, puzzled by the unfamiliar notification. What was this? He squinted at the message, confusion spreading across his features. Then the interface shifted, and a new announcement flashed. The system informed him that it would grant him the opportunity to become stronger as the first to reach the realm of the transcendent, but only if he allowed the system to reboot his player status. Suho stood tall, his figure framed by the swirling light. The word rebooting echoed in his ears, sending a chill through his spine. It was almost impossible to believe. As the light slowly faded, Suho found himself back in the vast, quiet library. The shelves around Suho glimmered with latent power, the weight of countless lives and experiences filling the air. As the realization sank in, he nodded slowly to himself. The system had sent him back to the past. He recalled his previous journey, reaching the unity of the divine sword, acquiring his first SS-grade skill, and now, here he was again at the starting point. His fingers brushed his chin as he fell into deep thought. Since he was the first to reach the transcendent state, the system was giving him another shot, something that had never even crossed his mind before. He paused, wondering if this return to the past was truly a coincidence. His fists clenched, resolve hardening in his chest. Whether by fate or design, he had returned. This time, not only could he prevent the events that had befallen him, but he could also prevent the chaos of the unpredictable gates, which had caused so many casualties in the past. With a deep breath, Suho's gaze sharpened. He had to make the most of this opportunity. The thought crossed his mind that perhaps he could conquer the gates faster this time. He couldn't afford to waste any time. He stepped into a taxi, determination driving every motion. As the taxi sped through the streets, Suho's resolve deepened. Whatever the cause, this was his chance, and he would take full advantage of it. The gates had caused enough damage before. Now, he could stop it from happening. He stepped out of the taxi, his fists tight with determination. He couldn't waste time. Not this time. His gaze hardened with purpose as he walked toward his goal. Soon, Suho stood before a grand building, its lights cutting through the night like a beacon. Nexus. His eyes narrowed as recognition settled in. It was the private hunter academy, Nexus. He had arrived. Inside the brightly lit reception area, Suho walked confidently up to the front desk. The receptionist looked up from her work with a smile, asking what had brought him to the academy that day. Suho replied calmly, stating that he needed to meet Director Kim Soo-ae. The receptionist's eyebrows lifted slightly, a note of surprise in her voice as she asked if he had an appointment. "No," Suho answered simply, "but I need to speak with her." The receptionist hesitated for a moment before apologizing, explaining that an appointment was required to meet with the director. Suho thought for a moment, then raised his hand as if an idea had come to him. "Could you just pass along a message?" he asked. "Tell her the solo conqueror of the Sindorum Station pre-catastrophe gate is here." The receptionist's eyes widened in shock. Without missing a beat, she nodded and quickly picked up the phone to call the director. The scene shifted, transitioning to a hallway leading toward a door labeled Director's Office. Inside, Director Kim Soo-ae stood behind a sleek desk, her presence composed and elegant. She greeted Suho with a polite nod as he entered. "I'm Kim Soo-ae, Director of Nexus Academy," she introduced herself, gesturing for him to sit. Suho returned the greeting and sat across from her. There was a slight air of awkwardness between them, but also an unspoken curiosity. After a beat, Director Kim spoke first, acknowledging the news she had heard about him, the solo conqueror of the Sindorum pre-catastrophe gate. She asked what had brought him to Nexus. Suho didn't hesitate. He explained that he had come to request a scholarship. Director Kim's eyebrows rose in surprise. Suho continued, mentioning that there was a hunter license test the following day, and he planned to take it. The director appeared momentarily startled, her interest piqued. "How long has it been since your awakening?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. When Suho told Director Kim that he had awakened just that very day, her eyes widened in disbelief. She quickly began flipping through the documents on her desk, as though trying to make sense of the information she had just received. Her voice stumbled for a moment, caught between surprise and confusion. "So, you're an unregistered hunter," she began, as if confirming the facts with herself, "who awakened today, and you intend to take the hunter license test tomorrow? And you're also the solo raider of the pre-catastrophe gate in Sindorum?" Suho nodded, his expression calm and steady, confirming that she had understood correctly. As he did, his thoughts drifted back to the connection he had at the Hunter Association, someone who had made it possible for him to register for the test despite the unusual circumstances. Director Kim leaned back in her chair, her gaze sharpening as she observed Suho more closely. There was a weight in the air, an intensity that she didn't often feel with candidates. Suho, without hesitation, made his request clear. He planned to aim for the top position in the test and, if successful, he asked for her to grant him a Nexus scholarship. Suho's confidence didn't falter, and as he spoke, his resolve was palpable. Director Kim's eyes narrowed as she considered the proposal, her thoughts weighing his words carefully. After a beat, she responded with a mix of challenge and intrigue in her voice, her tone implying that if he succeeded, the scholarship would indeed be well earned. The two locked eyes, the room falling into a tense silence. Both Suho and Director Kim seemed to be sizing each other up, each unwilling to back down from the silent challenge that hung in the air. There was a mutual understanding between them, a shared conviction that would shape the path forward. The moment was charged, and Suho knew that this was just the beginning of the journey he had set in motion. Suho spoke with confidence, suggesting that Director Kim should definitely give a scholarship. He seemed sure of himself, even though it might be hard for a complete beginner to come first in the exam. But he wasn't just a beginner, he was an experienced hunter who had already conquered many gates. Now, though, it was up to Director Kim whether she chose to believe him. Director Kim adjusted her glasses and pointed out the difficulties ahead, mentioning that the hunter test was very different from conquering a gate, even if it was something never seen before. She showed Suho a report with statistics about the hunter test, explaining that the average pass rate was under 20%, and this year's pass rate was only 15%. Suho just smiled at this. Then he made a suggestion. If he didn't come in first, she could forget about him and not give him the scholarship. Director Kim paused and then asked him why, out of all the academies like Hexagon and Prime, he had chosen Nexus. Suho explained that he picked Nexus because it was in the most disappointing situation. Director Kim blinked in surprise at this answer. She might have wanted to slap him for his boldness. Suho went on to say that Nexus Academy was the biggest in the country, but recently, it hadn't produced any first or second place winners, and the number of students was dropping. Director Kim sighed, admitting that this was true. As Director Kim adjusted her glasses, she thought about what Suho had said. They really needed to show better results, but there was no outstanding student yet. What if she accepted Suho's offer, and he actually came out on top? The one who conquered the Syndrome Station Gate and passed the hunter test with the highest score. If news like that spread, Nexus Academy would benefit a lot. It was an attractive idea. Then, there was just one more thing to figure out. Director Kim asked Suho how much money he expected from the scholarship. Suho asked how much the scholarship for the top student was. Director Kim explained that the top student would get a full refund of their tuition fees for the year, plus a 30 million won congratulatory bonus. On top of that, the top student could immediately join the Nexus Guild if they wanted. Suho nodded in approval. It was exactly what he expected from the largest academy. However, Director Kim suspected that Suho might not have expected such a large amount. She casually asked him how much he would honestly want. Suho thought for a moment, then smiled. He suggested 300 million won, considering the rewards of being the top student and the size of Nexus Academy. He pointed out that 300 million won wasn't much for a big academy like Nexus. Director Kim looked surprised at the amount, but after a moment, she nodded, agreeing to his proposal. All right, Director Kim said, nodding. She made an offer to Suho. If he passed as the top test taker, she would pay him 300 million won. She suggested they draft a contract, and for now, she asked Suho to take a look around the academy. The scene shifted to a new location near a clock tower, as evening turned into night. Suho admired the sight of the vast academy grounds, thinking about how huge Nexus was. It seemed even bigger than an amusement park. He realized that once he enrolled, he wouldn't have to worry about anything. Nearby, a man laughed, clearly excited about the academy, saying it was the largest in South Korea. As Suho and the man walked together, Suho's thoughts wandered. He noticed someone off in the distance, training on the playground. It was hard to see clearly, but it looked like a student. The man guiding him commented that the person training was Daehan, the most dedicated student. Suho raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is he training like that every day?" The man nodded, confirming that Daehan trained at this hour regularly. Suho watched as Daehan practiced with a weapon, swinging it precisely. The man called out to Daehan, reminding him that while practice was important, he also needed to take care of his body. Daehan turned toward them, smiling confidently, and said that, as a third-year student, he needed to work even harder. Suho watched Daehan closely and immediately recognized him. He remembered forming raid parties with Daehan in his previous life. Back then, Daehan had become the top tanker in the country, famous for his incredible mental strength and defense. It was unfortunate that the role of pure tankers had faded over time. Suho's eyes fell on the battle axe Daehan was holding. It was different from the shield that had suited him so well in the past. It seemed Daehan hadn't yet found his true calling. Suho saw this as an opportunity. Since Daehan would eventually join Nexus in the future, Suho thought it would be smart to connect with him now and later bring him into the Korean Hunter Association. Suho smiled and introduced himself as An Suho. They exchanged greetings, and Suho looked at the battle axe Daehan was holding. With curiosity, he asked if Daehan planned to use the axe as his main weapon. Daehan looked a bit unsure but explained enthusiastically that he aimed to be a melee user. Daehan had consulted others, and they had recommended the battle axe. They told him that weapons like that needed to match one's physique from the beginning, and in terms of destructive power, nothing could match a battle axe. Suho then asked if Daehan had only been using the battle axe, and Daehan nodded. He admitted that he was a bit slow to learn and that it had taken him 2 years to become proficient with it. Suho felt a bit lost for words and suddenly had a slight headache. He thought to himself that the real problem was that the battle axe didn't match Daehan's natural abilities. He wasn't sure if it was persistence or just stubbornness, but Daehan should have switched weapons earlier if he wasn't improving. Daehan noticed Suho was deep in thought and asked if something was wrong. Suho, still serious, thought about how the largest academy in the country seemed surprisingly lax. He then suggested Daehan should use a weapon he felt comfortable with. After all, players could adjust their stats, and with the skill correction effect, they could quickly improve proficiency. Suho pointed out that the battle axe didn't seem to suit Daehan. Daehan seemed confused, so Suho explained that the fact it had taken Daehan 2 years to get good with the battle axe showed a lack of synergy between Daehan and the weapon. Suho explained further, while the battle axe was powerful, the delay after each attack was too long. If there were no way to deal with that gap, Daehan would be vulnerable to counterattacks. He also noted that Daehan's large size made him difficult to protect by a tank if he was using a heavy weapon like the battle axe. Daehan was surprised by Suho's observations. He admitted that he'd been using the battle axe for 3 years and now felt like all that time might have been wasted. Suho reassured him, saying that if Daehan had been able to handle an unsuitable weapon for so long, it was likely that his true skills were more suited for being a tank. A tank? Daehan repeated, clearly surprised. Suho nodded and suggested Daehan try using a kite shield on his left arm and a one-handed bludgeon in his right hand. He added that Daehan's practical scores would probably improve significantly with this change. Daehan hesitated, asking if it wasn't too late to switch, especially with the test the next day. Suho asked him what he thought was the most important role in a party. Daehan guessed it was the mage, but Suho shook his head. He explained that the real core of a party was the tank, who had to draw aggro and protect the mage and healer for everything to function properly. Suho encouraged Daehan to wield a shield and use another weapon to control crowds in various ways. Daehan nodded slowly, starting to understand the reasoning. Daehan smiled and said he would give it a try. Suho praised him for not getting discouraged and for making such a smart decision so quickly. Daehan thanked Suho and walked away, eager to practice. As Daehan left, the man guiding Suho turned to him and asked if he was an instructor. Suho looked surprised and shook his head, saying he wasn't. The man then commented that Suho seemed to have a deep understanding of weapon synergy and hunter advice, which was unusual for someone without a license. Suho smiled and replied that he wasn't an instructor, but he knew a bit about that area. Wanting to change the subject, he asked if the contract was ready, since some time had passed. The man nodded, saying he had just received a call about it and suggested they head back to the director's office. The scene shifted to the next day, under a clear morning sky. The South Korea Hunter Association was busy with examinees, all holding their weapons and getting ready for the hunter's license test. Everyone looked like they were in peak condition, except for one person. Suho, the lone conqueror of the gate, sat there looking exhausted. He muttered to himself that he was tired from wandering around too much the day before. Around him, many people had gathered. Candidates were lined up, waiting for their turn to take the preliminary drug test, which was meant to catch any instances of doping. The announcer's voice echoed through the facility, telling everyone to line up by their assigned numbers. Suho, already tired from the long day, sighed inwardly and rubbed his temple. Although the doping test was necessary, it felt like an extra burden on top of everything else. He looked up, and his eyes briefly glowed blue, showing his special ability. Suho knew that drug tests alone wouldn't catch everything. Those who cheated often use skill buffs, not just conventional drugs, to gain an unfair advantage. His eyes scanned the room, and he noticed a glow around several people, indicating that they had been buffed far beyond the normal level 5 of a test taker. These weren't just average candidates. Their magical energy was much stronger because of the buffs. A system notification flashed before his eyes, congratulating him on mastering magic detection rank B. This new skill made his perception sharper, making it even easier to spot those who were cheating. Suho frowned, his mood darkening. It was disappointing to see so many people abusing buffs, even though the use of such abilities for cheating hadn't yet become widely known. Suho made a decision right then that something had to be done about it. His gaze moved up to the balcony, where he saw team leader Young Chulmin waving at him excitedly. Suho allowed himself a small smile. At least there was one person he could trust here. As Suho waited, he overheard some of the other candidates talking among themselves. They were complaining about how difficult the written exam was, with one candidate worrying that they might need to retake it. Another agreed, saying that the exam was insanely hard. Suho couldn't help but feel a little smug. Thanks to the Library of Memories, he had sailed through the exam without any trouble. He almost felt like a cheater himself, but for a very different reason. Just then, a familiar voice called out to him, snapping him out of his thoughts. Suho looked up to see Chulmin approaching with a warm and friendly expression. Chulmin asked how the test had gone, clearly curious. Suho just shrugged and said he thought he could pass it. Chulmin chuckled, commenting on Suho's confidence. He added that word had spread that this year's written exam had been the hardest one yet. Then, Chulmin got more serious, mentioning Suho's earlier comment about buff checks. He asked Suho what he had meant by that. Suho nodded thoughtfully and explained that while there were measures in place to prevent doping, like urine tests, blood tests, and confiscating belongings, he had noticed there were no checks for skill-related cheating. He suggested that conducting a magic detection scan could help spot anyone using illegal buffs. Chulmin's eyes widened slightly, and he thanked Suho for the information. He promised to look into it before the practical test began. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Suho. Chulmin expressed that he personally hoped Suho would succeed, saying he would love to work with him in the association. He encouraged Suho to do his best in the practical test. Suho nodded, appreciating the encouragement. It felt good to know someone was rooting for him. Just then, the loudspeaker crackled to life, drawing everyone's attention. The announcement informed the candidates that the test would be delayed by 2 hours due to issues with the dive capsules. They were told to have lunch in the cafeteria and wait in the lounge or training area for a while. Suho sighed in relief. The delay would give Chulmin more time to implement the buff check, which might make the test fairer for everyone. With 1,200 candidates and a passing rate under 10%, Suho guessed that the cheater purge could bring the pass rate down even further, maybe to 7%. But that would mean the candidates who passed were truly the best, and Suho liked the idea of being surrounded by top talent. He decided to use the extra time to keep an eye on the other candidates. Maybe there was someone among them worth noticing. Suddenly, Suho's attention was drawn to a commotion. A young man was approaching a much larger candidate, challenging him to a sparring match. The young man's voice was loud enough to attract everyone's attention as he insisted on having a match. The larger man looked clearly annoyed, demanding to know who the challenger was and telling him to get lost. But the challenger persisted, saying he didn't want to fight, just spar. He taunted the larger man, implying he was scared to show his skills. Suho watched with mild amusement. It was always interesting to see how hunters interacted. Sometimes, a small confrontation could reveal a lot about a person's true character. The larger man, clearly agitated, muttered under his breath, calling the challenger a nuisance and telling him to leave. The larger man added that he had no interest in picking a fight with a weakling. The young man, however, refused to back down. He took a step forward, suggesting that he might just attack first. With the tension rising, the young man lunged aggressively at the larger candidate, forcing the big man to react. The clash was sudden. The young man swung his sword powerfully toward his opponent. But before the blow could connect, Suho stepped in, blocking the sword with his own. The larger man looked at Suho in surprise, asking if he had lost his mind. Suho remained calm and assured the man that he would handle the challenger, and that there was no need for things to escalate further. The challenger, clearly agitated, demanded to know who Suho was. Suho explained that he was just another test taker, and that nothing good would come from getting involved in a fight. He suggested the bigger man leave it to him to handle the situation. The larger man huffed in frustration, muttering that he didn't care either way, and turned away. But the young man wasn't satisfied. He asked Suho why he was interfering, his irritation clear in his voice. Suho smiled and introduced himself as Suho, remarking that it seemed like the young man was looking for a sparring partner. He offered to be that partner instead. The young man sneered, dismissing Suho as weak and saying he had no interest in sparring with someone like him. Suho's eyes widened slightly at the insult. He was a bit taken aback by the comment. The young man, now more confident, mocked Suho further, suggesting that the earlier block had just been luck and warning him not to get cocky. Suho looked thoughtful for a moment, then tilted his head and asked if the young man was scared. The young man's face twisted with anger, and he demanded to know what Suho had just said. Suho repeated himself calmly, suggesting that it seemed like the young man was too scared to spar with him. The provocation worked, and the young man, now furious, declared that he was ready to teach Suho a lesson. He had been bored anyway, surrounded by cowards, and now Suho had just made himself the perfect target to be a punching bag. Suho smiled, pleased that the young man had accepted his challenge. Around them, people began murmuring, suggesting they should head to the sparring arena and get the supervisor's approval for an official match. The group moved to a large, empty arena, bright and open, with spectators casually gathering in the stands to watch. Some onlookers shook their heads, commenting on how unnecessary it was to cause a scene on such an important day. Others dismissed the participants as attention seekers. An official stepped forward as Suho and the young man prepared for the sparring match. The official explained that only training weapons provided by the association would be allowed and that he would stop the match if things got out of hand. He then gave a quick signal, declaring the sparring match to begin. The two competitors faced each other, each wielding a wooden sword. The atmosphere grew tense as the two opponents engaged in a rapid exchange, their movements quick and powerful. Park Young, the young man, swung his sword aggressively, trying to overpower Suho with sheer force. But Suho moved with practiced ease, blocking each strike with precision while keeping a close eye on his opponent. Frustrated, Park Young shouted that he would tear Suho apart. He lunged forward again, but Suho easily blocked the attack. Suho looked at him with a mix of surprise and disappointment, asking, "Why are you so weak?" Park Young's expression turned to one of disdain as he remarked that his opponent was hardly worth the effort. Enraged, Park Young began shouting insults at Suho, his rage evident in every word. Suho, feeling the tension thick in the air, took a moment to study the person in front of him. That's when the memories hit him. He recognized Park Young. The young swordsman wasn't just any competitor, he was someone Suho had encountered before. Park Young was a skilled swordsman, known for his fierce energy and his eyes burning with an insatiable thirst for power. Suho recalled the red mist that would swirl around him, a sign of the intense desire for strength that fueled his every move. Once, Park Young had been driven by the desire to become stronger, always seeking out the fiercest opponents in order to hone his skills. But over time, his obsession with power had led him down a darker path, turning him into a feared hunter-killer. Relentless in his pursuit of dominance, Park Young had lost himself in his quest. Suho's gaze narrowed as he recognized the same fire in Park Young's eyes. This was a man who could be so much more, but only if he didn't allow that thirst for power to consume him. Suho knew he had to intervene before Park Young made the same mistakes that had led to his downfall in the past. He smirked, the memories of their previous encounters flashing in his mind. Park Young had been formidable before, but Suho now saw the raw, unrefined nature of his skills. He wasn't yet the powerhouse Suho remembered. He was still struggling, still lacking the experience and refinement that would turn him into a true master. Suho sighed. It was strange to see Park Young here, in this test arena, in such a state. Despite his raw power, the swordsman still lacked control. Suho moved swiftly, stepping forward and landing a solid kick to Park Young's chest, sending him flying backward across the arena. Park Young's fall was dramatic, his body crashing to the ground with a loud thud. Suho remained standing, his expression bored as he looked down at his opponent. He couldn't help but mock Park Young's earlier confident words, thinking to himself that he had expected more from him. Park Young struggled to his feet, eyes wide with disbelief and pain. His breathing was heavy as he looked at Suho, still trying to process the strength he had just witnessed. His voice was thick with frustration as he demanded to know how Suho possessed such strength. Suho merely shrugged, a casual smile on his face as he suggested that rushing at him wouldn't work. He asked Park Young if he really wanted to continue, observing his stance. Suho quickly realized that this was likely Park Young's first time facing a level 10 opponent, as the strongest he'd probably fought before had been a level 5. Despite the setback, Park Young wasn't discouraged. A smirk appeared on his lips as he saw something intriguing in Suho, something he hadn't encountered in a long time. He remarked that now he understood why Suho had been so relaxed. The tension in the air thickened as Park Young prepared himself for another round. His grip on his sword tightened, and his eyes gleamed with a renewed determination. He declared that he would give it his all this time. Suho watched him carefully as Park Young began to gather his energy. A red aura swirled around him, and Suho couldn't help but smile, almost amused, as if humoring a child. With a shout, Park Young launched himself at Suho, his sword cutting through the air with intense force. The two clashed in a blur of rapid movements. The sound of their weapons striking echoed across the arena, each swing carrying the weight of their power. For a moment, Park Young seemed to push Suho back, their energies colliding like waves crashing against a rock. Suho could feel the weight behind Park Young's strikes, acknowledging that they were definitely heavier than before. Park Young, panting, sneered at Suho, his frustration clear as he asked if Suho would continue to act so relaxed. His red aura flared up even more, intensifying as he prepared for a decisive blow. He roared, daring Suho to stop his next attack. Suho's eyes widened slightly as Park Young assumed a new stance. He recognized it immediately. It was the dragon sword technique, the technique Suho knew all too well. With a powerful shout, Park Young launched his attack. His sword came down with lightning speed, aiming straight for Suho. The collision of their forces caused a massive explosion, blinding light filling the arena. For a moment, it seemed like Park Young had succeeded. He stood panting, a smug smile on his face as he muttered to himself that he had won. But as the light faded, Suho remained standing, his sword held firmly in his hand, having blocked the attack with ease. He sighed lightly and grinned, meeting Park Young's shocked gaze. He commented that he had blocked the strike without much effort. He could even do it with his eyes closed. Park Young's eyes were wide with disbelief. He stammered, trying to process how Suho had managed to stop him. Suho, however, quickly analyzed the attack. It wasn't truly the dragon sword technique, not yet. What Park Young had used was a basic sword technique, though with some flair. Wounded in his pride, Park Young let out a furious shout, calling Suho a bastard. But Suho didn't react to the insult. Instead, he simply stood ready for the next round. The fight raged on, with Park Yong attacking with relentless force. His sword swung with all the power he could muster, the red energy around him growing brighter with each strike. Suho was momentarily pushed back, but he remained calm, carefully watching for an opening. When Park Yong saw Suho being forced back, he believed he had found his opportunity. He lunged forward, throwing everything he had into one final strike. Suho, however, blocked it effortlessly, as if it was nothing. Before Park Yong could react, Suho stepped forward and delivered a swift punch to his jaw. Park Yong stumbled backward, his head spinning from the force of the blow. Park Yong staggered, his vision swimming from the punch. He muttered in disbelief, struggling to stay upright, wondering how Suho had managed it. Suho simply shook his head, remarking that Park Yong's attacks were too slow. Without a second word, Suho watched as Park Yong flew across the arena, landing with a thud. He took a moment to breathe, realizing it was time to finish this. He didn't want to break Park Yong's spirit too much. There was no need to cause any more damage to his confidence. The arena went quiet. Suho stood still and composed while Park Yong lay on the ground, unconscious. Suho considered what had just happened. Park Yong had potential, but his obsession with power was his downfall. Suho reflected on his past life and how things had turned out for Park Yong. He couldn't let history repeat itself, not this time. The past was filled with regrets, but the present offered a chance to change things. Suho knew Park Yong's fixation on him would make him obsessed until he managed to defeat him. But Suho was confident that would never happen. Suho thought the testing center would become quieter now, and with that in mind, he called out for the supervisor. The supervisor responded, clearly shocked, but he quickly got a handle on the situation. Suho explained he'd accidentally knocked Park Yong out and requested the supervisor take care of him until he woke up. The supervisor, nervous but understanding, promised to handle it. Suho nodded and turned his attention to the test area, where technicians were hard at work. The high-tech lab was filled with activity, and there were dive capsules set up in rows. Suho observed closely, noting the presence of more skilled technicians than usual. He suspected that some of them might be undercover doping inspectors, keeping an eye out for candidates who might be using illegal buffs. Suho overheard a nearby conversation between a technician and a candidate. The technician was calming the candidate, explaining that they weren't compatible with the current capsule and directing them to another. Suho found it odd but didn't think much of it. It was then his turn to undergo the test. A technician gestured for him to lie down in one of the capsules. Suho did so without hesitation. The technician gave him instructions, advising him to press a button if he felt any discomfort or unusual sensations during the dive. Suho nodded to show he understood. The technician initiated the process, and the capsule's interface lit up, showing the dive progress. A voice from the system announced that the Hunter Practical Test program was now active. The progress bar showed as the connection to Suho's consciousness was established. Once completed, the system confirmed that the healer practical test scenario was now starting. The environment around Suho shifted as the test began. Suho focused his mind, preparing himself for the challenge ahead. This was a test not just of his fighting skills, but his potential to be a healer, an integral role in any party. He steadied his breath, ready for what was to come. Suho found himself standing in the middle of a desolate, reddish cityscape. The buildings around him were crumbling, debris scattered everywhere, and the entire place gave off an eerie, lifeless vibe. He couldn't help but think that this exam was notoriously difficult, especially given the low pass rate for healers. As he took in the ruined surroundings, his attention was drawn to a young girl kneeling on the ground, crying. She appeared to be injured, and instinctively, Suho moved toward her. The whole scene felt unnervingly real, with distant screams echoing in the air, adding to the grim atmosphere. Suho's mind raced as he took in the devastation around him. How had the Great Hunter Association managed to create such an intense, chaotic scenario? It felt less like an exam and more like an ordeal designed to break you. He muttered to himself, bitterly noting that the association had no sense of moderation. The test seemed tailored to traumatize candidates, and Suho felt a wave of fatigue and frustration creep over him. Sighing deeply, he clenched his fist. He knew why healers were so highly valued. They were always at the heart of the chaos, expected to provide life-saving support even in the most dire of situations. Healers had to be strong, not in the way of warriors or mages, but in their resilience and selflessness. It was a role that required sacrifice. But that didn't make it any less daunting. The practical test was the true measure of a hunter's ability, where their class and skills were truly put to the test. For combatants, warriors, mages, archers, it was all about fighting, surviving, and defeating as many enemies as possible. The scenarios were constantly shifting, with different criteria for passing each year. It wasn't just about winning, it was about how well they handled various threats, the number of enemies they took down, and how long they survived. But for healers, the test was different. It wasn't about defeating enemies or outlasting opponents. It was about selflessness and sacrifice. A healer who could perform well in combat was important, but what mattered more was their willingness to risk their life for others, to protect and save those in need, no matter the cost. Suho understood that this was the essence of healing. The score was never just about magical proficiency, it was about putting others before yourself, even if it meant dying in the process. He braced himself, knowing what the test would likely demand of him. Healers often had to sacrifice themselves for their patients in this simulation. Healers who died trying to save someone were often the ones who scored the highest. It was a challenge unlike anything faced by combat-oriented classes. The thought of dying for the sake of the test didn't sit well with Suho, but he knew the system had revived him once before. If necessary, he would bend the rules. As he approached the sword embedded in the ground nearby, Suho's lips curled into a faint smile. The notion of being expected to die willingly for the test seemed absurd, but if it came down to it, he would find a way to survive. He wasn't just any healer. Suddenly, desperate cries filled the air, snapping Suho out of his thoughts. He turned sharply, listening intently to the screams that seemed to reverberate all around him. But when he looked, all he saw was death. Bodies littered the ground, fallen figures frozen in terror, their faces locked in their final moments of agony. The entire simulation area felt like a battlefield, where no hope remained and only one survivor was left standing. Suho moved closer to the girl he had seen earlier. Kneeling beside her, he took a moment to assess the situation. The girl's eyes were still wide open, filled with fear and uncertainty. Suho crouched down beside her, gently asking if she was okay as he examined her injuries. Her voice trembled as she struggled to speak, warning him in a hushed tone that the enemies would return and they needed to leave before it was too late. Suho gave her a reassuring smile, shaking his head. He told her that rescue teams were on the way, that she would be safe soon, and that he'd protect her until they arrived. His resolve solidified in that moment. He would protect her, no matter what. Back in the real world, the exam facility was a hive of activity. Pods filled the room, each occupied by an examinee immersed in their own simulation. One test taker stepped out of his pod, rubbing his neck in discomfort, muttering to himself that he could have done more. His expression was a mix of exhaustion and disappointment. A staff member, a woman in a neat uniform, offered him a warm smile and thanked him for his effort, instructing him to gather his belongings and head home. The man nodded, still lost in his thoughts as he made his way out. Nearby, his results flashed on a screen. Kong Jin Young, class, archer, time, 9 minutes, 4 seconds. The woman glanced at the scores, sighing as she noted how low they were for this season. The difficulty must have been particularly high this year, she murmured, before asking another staff member, Director Shin, about the status of Suho's simulation. Director Shin glanced at his screen and answered that Suho had been in his pod for quite some time. The woman was surprised. "It's been 30 minutes, she remarked, noting that most candidates usually spent no more than 15 minutes in the simulation. She leaned closer to the screen, confirming the time, 30 minutes and 21 seconds. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Who is this person? Both Director Shin and the woman turned their attention to the real-time feed of Suho's simulation. On the screen, Suho was wielding a sword, cutting down monsters with ease, all while keeping the injured girl safe. The woman, impressed, commented that he was a fantastic fighter and asked if he was a warrior. Director Shin shook his head, pointing to the screen. "No, he's actually a healer." The woman scoffed, clearly disbelieving. "A healer? But he's holding a sword." Director Shin motioned for her to look more closely. As she did, she saw that Suho wasn't just fighting. He was seamlessly blending in healing magic, pausing between each sword swing to mend the girl's wounds and protect her from the advancing creatures. His movements were precise, and his attention never wavered from the injured girl. The woman couldn't help but be stunned. This is incredible. A healer fighting like this? She paused, then questioned, "Isn't he supposed to be disqualified for not dying? I thought they usually wanted the healer to sacrifice themselves." Director Shin explained that there was no reason for disqualification. The goal for a healer is to protect the patient to the very end. That's what Suho is doing, and he's doing it perfectly. He's fulfilling all the requirements of the test. The screen showed Suho blocking more monster attacks, staying by the girl's side, never abandoning her. He kept healing her at every opportunity, his focus never shifting from his patient's well-being. The woman watched in awe as Suho fought with such skill while ensuring the girl stayed safe, her injuries healing with each passing moment. Director Shin highlighted that Suho was fulfilling all the necessary criteria for the test. He was staying close to his patient, healing her when necessary, and putting his life at risk to protect her. Since he met all the conditions, there was no reason for him to be disqualified. Even the practical system itself did not intervene. The woman nodded, slowly realizing that the top candidate in this practical exam had likely already been determined. In the simulation, Suho stood in the now darkened, ruined landscape, his sword tightly gripped in his hands. Several small green lizard-like creatures emerged from the shadows, their movements hostile and quick. Suho surveyed them calmly, unsheathing his sword in one fluid motion. As the creatures charged toward him, he responded with precision, slicing through all of them in a single strike. He muttered to himself, feeling that it wasn't quite enough. His movements weren't fast enough. He needed to be quicker. So, he pushed himself further, speeding up his attacks. His body moved fluidly, evading their strikes as he sliced through them with a grace and power that spoke of years of experience. As the last creature fell, a system notification flashed before him. The system acknowledged Suho's exceptional grasp of the footplay technique and congratulated him for mastering it. Suho smiled with satisfaction. Even in this virtual reality, the system was able to detect his skill level. He knew how the system operated, monitoring his movements, acknowledging his mastery, and rewarding his progression. Though the experience gains were slower here compared to real physical exertion, it was still an ideal training environment. As Suho continued to fight, he felt a surge of progress. Along with his mastery of footplay, he upgraded all the swordsmanship skills he had gained to rank A. It wasn't providing experience points or items, but the feeling of improvement was rewarding enough. Another notification flashed, congratulating him for upgrading his horizontal slash to a rank. Suho envisioned his skill set as a grid, considering the potential growth of his abilities. If he could upgrade every fundamental sword skill to a rank or higher, he knew he could eventually access a technique as powerful as Park Yong's Dragon Sword technique. Suddenly, the system notification changed. It pulsed with a brilliant, glowing energy, unlike any notification he had seen before. Light enveloped Suho as the system informed him that his understanding of swordsmanship surpassed anyone else's. The system was impressed with his unique approach and offered to integrate his fundamental sword techniques and footplay into a new skill. Once registered, this new skill would have its own rank, and he could even name it himself. Suho's eyes gleamed with determination as a satisfied smile spread across his face. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With a calm, assured voice, he whispered, "Welcome back, my sword, my guardian sword."